You don't need blood, skulls, or cobwebs to make a creepy Halloween room. Learn some great techniques, including how to make miniature fairy light candles. In a previous video, I assembled this Crimson Bond piano and made it look fancy, but now I'm making it look creepy. I only partially assembled the piano so I can drill holes in the plastic and run lights that'll eventually become candles. I'm drilling my holes large enough to fit LED bulbs and holding the piano tightly. When I was assembling the piano, I didn't know where I would be drilling the holes, but now that you see my process, you could pre-drill these holes before assembly. I made sure my fairy lights can fit and start pulling the light through the hole. These are battery-powered LED lights. I pulled the light through the hole and then 2 more because this area of the piano will have a cluster of 3 different candles. The wires and battery pack will be hidden inside the bottom of the piano. To tidy up the wires and stiffen the lights, I'm twisting the wires. These cheap lights from Amazon are pretty tough, but I did repeatedly check that they're still working throughout the project because it would really suck to finish the whole project and realize none of the lights you strung work. If you find yourself with a light bulb that's inside of your project and won't be seen, you can cover it with duct tape so the light won't shine from within. This piano has a lot of gaps and cracks, so an illuminated light inside of it would emphasize all of the flaws. I pulled 3 more lights on the left side of the piano, then accidentally snapped the shelf off while I was drilling holes in the top. I'm not replacing the missing shelf because I'll make 3 taller candles there, and I couldn't find it. For the very top of the piano, I removed the side piece so I don't break it and used small pliers to cut some holes for the top. This ultimately proved unnecessary, but it really isn't a miniature project unless there's some wasted effort. For the candles, I'm using a thick straw from a water bottle and a regular drinking straw. I'm cutting the thick plastic straw with my miter shears, but I eventually learned I could also cut this with my scissors. I'll be adding this thick chunky boy to the back row, so I tested the height before adding some hot glue to the bottom and plopping the straw in place. The bottom of the straw is filled with hot glue, so I'm holding it in place while it sets. I'll be covering my candles in wax later, so to save some wax, I'm mostly filling the straw with hot glue now. These LED lights have a weird shape with 2 wires coming off of it, so I'm repositioning it toward the front so it looks like a thin flame instead. Lastly, I'm hot gluing the straw to the back of the piano so it doesn't shift around. The drinking straw is too small to slide over the light, so I'm cutting it up the middle so I can just place it over the wires. For each of the straw candles, I'm pressing them into hot glue and holding them steady while the glue sets. For added realism and interest, I created the 3 clusters of candles on either side of the piano in a different way. The cluster on the left has 2 chunky candles and then a taller one in the back. I filled all of the straws with hot glue and positioned the lights so they're facing forward. To add the candles to the top of the piano, I need to run the wires along the back of the piano hutch. I'm using some metal pliers to cure the hot glue immediately and flatten it. The hole on the back of the piano holds a real glass mirror, which I'm making look like mercury glass using some silver rub and buff. I'm covering the entire mirror with a layer of the silver paint. Rub and buff dries almost immediately, so I'm coming in with a paper towel to remove texture from the surface and a bit of the paint. To add age spots, I'm using a pointy tool to scrape some of the paint off of the surface of the mirror in a circular motion. This makes little darker spots that stand out from the rest of the mirror. I'm finishing by adding some watered down black acrylic paint. Now this miniature mirror won't reflect a full-size world. I linked my fireplace makeover video in the description below, which shows a different process for creating mercury glass. I added the different lights, varying the heights and thicknesses of the candles and tacking down the wire as I went. I kept the battery pack loose. Now comes the most transformative part where I add the wax to the candles. I think white will look best, but it looks clear as I'm pouring it, so it may be hard to see what I'm doing. Once the wax cools, you'll be able to see the shape you've created around your straw candles. If your candles are taking a lot of wax to fill, top them off with hot glue before proceeding. These lights are pretty heat resistant and I've taken flames and hot glue to them, so don't worry too much about ruining them. It can be a bit clumsy pouring the wax, so you might want to do this in layers if you're a bit more patient than I am. Allowing the wax to dry in between layers will give you more control of the shape and size of the puddles. This looks good just as it is, but there's an excessive amount of wax in weird places like the back, so I'm going in with an X-Acto knife and the end of a matchstick to tidy it up a bit. There's no doubt this piano is the centerpiece of the room box, but now I'm adding smaller details. I have a stash of miniature printables and other accessories in this little plastic container. I'm grabbing a sheet of sheet music and some letters and ephemera. These were printed from an Etsy file. This one particular piece looks closest to a love letter. I'm folding the piece of paper so it's overlapped so I can add a wax seal. I'm making my wax seal with hot glue. I'm squeezing the hot glue onto a metal lid and sticking 2 twisted thick pieces of wire into the hot glue until it cures. I've learned from Little Gretchen's workshop to make multiples of something so you have them on hand later when you need them. I painted 6 of my little wax seals. I'm removing a hot glue wax seal with tweezers, which did scuff the paint, so I suggest using your fingers to remove them. To make it look like someone's already opened this letter, I only attached the wax seal to the top flap so it's open. For the sheet music, I trimmed some of the extra margins around the edges and rubbed some brown chalk pastels into the surface to age it. I'm not entirely sure why this looks so good, but I often line the edges of aged pieces of paper with brown marker. As a finishing touch, I'm using a paintbrush to lightly curl the edges of this piece of paper so it's not perfectly flat. For an additional paper detail, I'm making a miniature rose using some tracing paper. I'm using tracing paper because it's thinner than something like computer paper. I'm using watercolor to add some color to the paper so I can cut out petals and flowers for my rose. Initially, the watercolor paint was just sitting on the surface, but with a little bit of coaxing, it will absorb into the paper. I want this to look like a red rose that has aged and died, but I am adding other colors to the paper so I can use this paper in the future for different projects. This tracing paper is pretty thin and semi-transparent, so I was expecting the color to bleed through to the other side, but it unfortunately didn't. I don't want my petals and leaves to have color on only one side, so I'm painting the back as well. To save some time, I'm using watered down acrylic paint, which is applying more quickly. I'm also saving time by using the same shade of green to back the 4 different shades I used on the front. I'm backing the red, purple, and pink tones with the same color as well. If you don't have access to tracing paper, I think white tissue paper may work even better, and you could also use computer paper in a pinch. I allowed the paper to dry, and to make it more malleable and easily take shapes of petals and leaves, I'm crunching it up into a ball. This helps break up the paper fibers and loosen the acrylic paint, which did dry stiffer than the watercolor paint. It also created some nice wrinkles, which mimics veins. The entire time, my plan was to cut out some circles using a hole punch, but I couldn't get a clean cut. To give the paper more strength and structure, I folded it several times to see if that would do the trick. Maybe this would have worked with a sharper hole punch, but mine is 5 years old and from the Dollar Tree, so I had to employ a different tactic. I finally got a nice clean cut by backing the piece of paper with a stiff piece of cardstock. I also folded the piece of paper several times so I can cut more petals at once. To make leaves, I grabbed my biggest scissors and cut leaf shapes. Now I'm adding some shape to the petals using my trusty Dollar Tree ball stylus and a piece of foam. If you don't have a piece of foam, you could use some layers of paper towels or even your hand to shape the petals. I haven't really found a great substitute for a ball stylus, so the next time you're at the Dollar Tree, I would pick one of these up. To create different shapes, for some of them I rolled the ball stylus in a circle, and for others I'm only pinching it in one part of the petal. I love the different shades, and the color is a bit deeper in real life versus on camera. To form the center of the rose, I added some glue to one of my petals and wrapped it around the tip of my needle bottle. I'm gluing the center to the end of some sewing thread I stiffened with glue and allowed to dry. I'm adding glue to the very base of the petals, attaching them directly across from one another to start forming the shape of a rose. The more petals you add, the bigger your rose will be. Since all of my petals are the same size, this was probably a bit more challenging, so if you have different size hole punches, you may want to utilize them. You could use the smaller petals toward the center and bigger on the outside. I don't know what these tiny leaves are called, but I'm adding 3 small leaves to the underside of the rose for more detail and realism. I trimmed my long piece of thread and added a couple leaves to finish off the rose. If you'd like to make a rosebud, you can create a center just like we did previously and glue a few petals side by side. I'm using tiny tweezers to roll these around the middle of the rose. To make the rose fuller, I'm adding petals to the outside just like I did on the original rose. I do prefer this method because it's less finicky. I recently visited Earth and Tree Miniature Shop and picked up this beautiful wooden harp for only $3. It doesn't really need much of anything, but I always like to update the gold on miniatures to get a more pleasing color. I'm using antique gold rub and buff and applying it with a Q-tip so I keep my fingers clean and I don't have to clean any brushes. It's hard to see on camera, but the rub and buff gold is less green and more realistic with more luster. I dirtied up one of my paintbrushes with Rub and Buff for a different project, so I'm cleaning the excess off of the brush and adding color to this black metal frame. Let me know if you think the musical instruments, candles, creepy old photo, a rose, and an open letter tell a story. I'd love to hear your theories about what happened here.